Hello, I'm Robin Minter-Smyers. I'm a partner at Thompson Hine and president of the board of directors at the City Club of Cleveland. On behalf of my fellow directors, I am pleased to welcome you to our 2020 annual meeting. In an ordinary year, we'd be together at the forum, but this is no ordinary year. So here we are convening virtually, as we have for so many months of this pandemic. We are grateful that you're here. We all know what this year has meant to our community and our nation, and what challenges it has brought to institutions like the City Club. But what you'll hear from our team today is a story of strength and resilience. To be sure, we are facing challenges, and those challenges are unprecedented. But the support and engagement that you and others in the community have shown, and the innovation and creativity of the City Club team, all of that has added up to a City Club that continues to deliver on its mission, to convene conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. The forum coming up today is another great example of that. Suzanne Nossel, the CEO of PEN America, will speak with us about the state of freedom of speech in our nation. PEN America is a 98-year-old organization championing freedom of expression and the written word. And Suzanne Nossel has just written a vitally important book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. In these troubled and complicated times of cancel culture and partisan strife, Suzanne's book is a call to action and a roadmap to help us learn to listen to one another again. Suzanne is also a dear friend and former college classmate with whom I've shared adventures a long, long time ago in South Africa and Namibia. It is such a special pleasure to have her at the City Club virtual podium today. Our conversation with Suzanne Nossel starts at 12:30, but right now I invite you to hear from the City Club team. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the 108th annual meeting of the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here. It is so great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sticking with us through this pandemic. Thank you for being a part of everything we've been doing this past year. Your resilience this past year has meant resilience for the City Club. We have been here from before the pandemic through this pandemic. We are continuing through the pandemic. We will be here on the other side, all because of you and because of these great people who are here with me today. So thank you for being a part of this. We're going to take a little moment today to talk about the year that was, our 108th year, and to talk about how we're making it through the pandemic and to talk about what's coming up. So first up is Stephanie Jancy, our fearless director of programming, without whom none of this would have been possible.
Oh, thank you, Dan, for your kind words. We're going to start pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, the City Club was on pace to have one of its most successful programming years in recent history. By early March, we had convened 80 forums and were on track to execute between 120 and 130 forums by the end of the fiscal year. Our average attendance was up to 150 people, and between December 2019 and March 2020, 45% of our forums were sellouts. We presented many prominent new voices like playwright Dominique Morisseau, Major League Baseball's Billy Beane, and Jerron Smith, who shared his impressive journey from Cleveland to the White House. We were also joined by writers, scholars, thought leaders, and mayors from around the country through our popular Urban Leadership Series. Our annual State of the Schools address attracted 900 people, educators, community members, and students from across the region. It was one of our largest events ever. And Senator Sherrod Brown made the City Club one of the first stops on his book tour, and he agreed to be interviewed by his wife, Connie Schultz. As you can tell, it was a great year, and everyone at the City Club was very excited to see how long we could keep these streaks going. And then the pandemic reached Ohio. We had to change course, and much of what you'll hear today is how we did just that. We ended the fiscal year with 109 forums, 80 in person and 29 virtual. While that number may seem smaller than what you heard in years past, what we accomplished was actually much larger. And here to start sharing some of those accomplishments is Bliss Davis, our content and programming coordinator, who will share the successes of our youth programming.
Thank you, Stephanie. So this past year, we had more than 1,000 students attend 42 of our student programming. Our forum council started with a sellout crowd in October, and our attendance stayed strong with more than 150 people attending our forums through the rest of the forums of the year. In the spring, our 2020 annual high school debate championship on March 13th was our last in-person forum due to crowd restrictions, and we had to limit our audience to family, coaches, and judges only. And finally, the last youth forum of the year on sustainability ended up being one of our first virtual forums in April. The students planned and hosted it virtually without a hitch.
Thank you, Bliss. The youths are an important part of our programming, and they were very resilient and adaptable as we made some of these changes. So as I said, in early March, we had to pivot to virtual forums, and it was almost immediate. When the first COVID-19 cases were confirmed in Ohio, we radically changed our forums for that week. A previously scheduled forum with the president of the American Medical Association was canceled, and in its place, an audienceless forum on the pandemic was designed and created in 24 hours. 4 local health experts addressed an empty room, but more than 1,000 people watched the live stream and submitted 100 audience questions. It remains the top watch forum of 2020 so far. After that, 16 previously scheduled in-person forums were canceled while we grappled with the topics and speakers to feature as our world dramatically changed. And from March until June, we held 29 forums that reached 9,000 people, an average of 300 people per forum. And we did it without skipping one Friday. The forums focus on a smaller range of topics than normal: the pandemic and its effects on both physical and mental health, the ensuing economic crisis, the election, and the racial justice movement sweeping the country. Rather than planning forums months in advance, we had to plan week to week, and everyone on staff chipped in as all of our jobs dramatically changed. But likely none more so than Maria Gerstenberger, our manager of content and experience, who had to create a virtual City Club stage in just a matter of days. I'd like to introduce Maria, who will tell that story.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's hard to even remember the events we did before March. Our biggest challenges back then were the large offsites you mentioned. When in-person events stopped, we faced the challenge of how to produce virtual forums. We learned lessons right away, like when we got Zoom bombed during the second virtual forum. The bright side of that was we were able to turn our experience into something the community could learn from, and the blog became a teaching tool and was our most read blog that year. We've been learning ever since, testing new streaming platforms and developing our own best practices for virtual forums. We were able to use our newfound expertise to help local organizations like the Cleveland Foundation host their own virtual events. As our digital workload grew, we needed more people to train to help with production. So Stephanie and Chef Adam stepped up to learn those new skills.
Yeah, we had to step up to learn StreamYard to help with the forum production, as well as partner with LMM to help them create food for the homeless. We started in April, and as of June, we made 7,100 pounds of food for about 10,000 meals per week. Hey, Neil, what kind of food did we create?
The different varieties of foods consist of chicken, pork, venison, and ground beef, a whole lot of ground beef. Also, on my downtime, I contribute to help the City Club team outreach to make calls to the 1,000 members that we have.
Adam and Neil, thank you so much. It's really impressive what you've been able to do through that partnership with Lutheran Metropolitan Ministries, and we're proud to work alongside you. Latasha, you've worked very hard to help prepare us for an eventual return to welcoming guests back into the City Club. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little.
How you doing? My name is Latasha Crenshaw. I am the catering and sales banquet manager. During this difficult time, I had to brainstorm ideas to come up with a safe return. We came up with a survey, sent it out to all of our members. We got great feedback. It helped us welcome back some of our private events.
Thank you, Latasha. Julie, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the operations and the financial side of things.
Thanks, Dan. Before COVID-19, in early March, we had approved a new flex and work at home policy. We'd also been working closely with our IT firm, Excelis, and we were almost 100% cloud-based. We also beefed up our firewall as well as installed multi-factor authentication. So when the pandemic hit, we had quite a smooth transition to a work from home environment. Next, we secured a PPP loan, which allowed us to retain all of our full-time employees and increase our cash reserves. We retrained and prepared for our new virtual world. I'm happy to report that at the end of fiscal year 2020, the City Club broke even financially. As you could expect, with no in-person forums, we lost over $200,000 in ticket sales and $160,000 in corporate sponsorship and support. Two things that were critical to our financial stability. One, we immediately took measures to cut expenses, and the second is that we were very fortunate that many of our donors, individual, corporate, and foundation, removed their gift restrictions, and that provided essential operating support during this period. Moving forward, we continue to look for new revenue streams, evaluate our financial operations, and set up operating protocols for returning to in-person forums. Finally, I want to acknowledge the growing support to our endowment. The City Club received two significant unrestricted gifts from the Barbara Piknovic Trust and the Carolyn Waldman Trust this year, and they totaled over $617,000. This now leads us to advancement. So Director of Advancement, Noel, can you take over?
Thanks, Julie. Well, you reported a lot of what I work on and the support that we had from corporate and foundation folks. In March, we were on track to have a very strong year, as you've heard, both programmatically and with financial support. And when we had to shift online, we ended up calling all 92 of our corporate and foundation partners to have a conversation. How are things going for you? How are things changing? And what can we expect? Part of that conversation was asking for these reallocations, and I'm happy to report that with their support, we were able to focus on the programming at hand and the challenge that we had. We also saw individual support step up, including our board that did a special match to help us in the end of the year, and folks who were returning their ticket and table sales to help support us in that end of year. So together, it was an incredible show of strength that we can't thank you all for enough. In fact, so much of what we end up accomplishing here at the City Club is because of our incredible membership support. And here's Alyssa, Membership and Advancement Manager, to tell us more about that.
Thank you, Noel. I'm really excited to share a little bit about the extraordinary growth that we saw in both membership and individual giving in the last year. We saw an extraordinary 5-year peak in membership, reaching 1,006 individual members. And all of those members we were in touch with right as the pandemic hit in March. We made calls to all of those members, and everyone on the team really stepped up to support us in that work. I also want to take a moment to note that our annual fund campaign was extraordinarily successful too because of the support of our members and friends in the community. We actually doubled our goal for that campaign, which came, you believe it, in March. What an exciting month for us. But you all really showed your support for us. And it really encouraged our team to realize that the programming we're doing is really important and that you notice it and that you think that the work we're doing is really important. I do want to give a shout out to all of our members who engaged with us on a deeper level last year by volunteering with us. Stephanie mentioned a few of our major offsite events, including the forum with Sherrod Brown and Connie Schultz, as well as our State of the Schools. And we saw a number of City Club members volunteer to help people find their seats or have just a really great experience at those forums. And we're grateful to those of you who stepped up and volunteered with our small but mighty team at those forums. And finally, I just want to talk about one of my favorite member engagement pieces, which is our member roundtables. We were able to have 2 in-person roundtables during the last year, and then we had 3 virtual roundtables, which really meant a lot to our team to see you, our members, even virtually on a Zoom screen, just to be able to interact with you, because it has been really difficult not to see you every week in person. And someone who we were expecting to see in person, but ended up being with us virtually, was our intern, Abby Henry. And I'm going to turn it over to Abby to share a little bit about her experience as the City Club's first virtual intern. Abby?
Thanks, Alyssa. Many of our members might not recognize me because I've been serving as the City Club's first virtual intern. From my home across the state in Toledo, I've been assisting Stephanie with programming tasks, helping Alyssa with member outreach and communications, and experiencing firsthand what it's like to work in the nonprofit sector. In August, my virtual office switched from my front porch in Toledo to a campus apartment at Denison University, where I'm currently a senior studying political science. My roommates listen in on virtual forums, City Club speakers have informed my senior thesis, and I've even connected with a former City Club speaker at our local farmers market. While being part of this team has taught me so many skills that I'll take with me wherever I end up, the most informative part of my experience with the City Club has been what I've learned through observation: how to be perseverant and creative in times of hardship, how to prioritize your community, and how to truly partake in democracy. And I've learned all of this without ever stepping foot in the City Club building.
Abby, thank you so much. We're so grateful to you for being a part of our team, even as you've continued your studies at Denison. And we're just really grateful that we've gotten to work with you as well. Finally, Tiffany France is the face that greeted members at every forum, every in-person forum, I should say, and has continued to greet all of us on our weekly meetings. And Tiffany, I want to ask you to say just a few words.
Thank you, Dan. If there's anything that this year has taught us, is that we need each other. We need community. Our relationships are what makes us strong, and we have had decades of breaking bread and engaging new ideas together. I think back to when we were in the office and I sat in front of our mural created by April Bleakney that reads a portion of our creed. I'm a product of the people, a cross-section of the community, weak as I am weak and strong in their strength. And now more than ever, I'm reminded of that message. Last year, our work resonated with growing audiences because of the 130 community partners, 145 sponsors, and more than 1,000 members who partner with us. Our speakers, your questions keep our forums relevant, and generous donors help make sure we didn't miss a single week when we moved to virtual programming. To be resilient, we need to begin with a solid foundation. At the City Club, that foundation is you. And while we are missing seeing you every week, we are grateful that you've made sure that we know you're there. So thank you for staying connected on social media. Thank you for all your retweets, shares, and comments. Lastly, nothing will be made possible without the City Club team and board of directors. Through life changes, a pandemic, social injustice, you came to work, you showed up, and made these virtual programs happen. Thank you. You are the cross-section of this community. We are weak as you are weak and strong in your strength. On behalf of the City Club, our deepest gratitude to you all.
Tiffany, thank you so much. That was very well said. I don't think I could say anything more. Finally, I want to thank all of you, my teammates, my colleagues. You are amazing people. And on behalf of the community, I thank you for all the work that you've been doing. And on behalf of the board of directors, I thank you as well. And finally, on behalf of the staff, I thank our board of directors for everything that you have done to help to shepherd us through this pandemic, all of your support, all of your counsel. It's so helpful. Again, all of you who have tuned into our annual meeting, thank you. It's your resilience that is our resilience. As Tiffany said, we are weak as you are weak, strong in your strength, and I will add resilient in your resilience. Thank you so much. We're about to start a forum. We'll see you there. Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. My name is Dan Moulthrop. I'm Chief Executive here and a proud member. Today is October 23rd. Today is the day of the City Club's annual meeting. And as we do, we're presenting a forum on free speech. And as we have since the pandemic hit Ohio, we're live from the studios of 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream. They are our public media partner, and we're very grateful for their partnership. These are challenging times for our nation's First Amendment and our commitment as a people to the idea of freedom of speech. We love it, we cherish it, and yet we live in an era where digital platforms have given purveyors of hate speech a larger audience than they ever might have acquired before. We live in an era characterized by phrases like no platforming and cancel culture, shorthand for the impulse to censor speech we don't wish to hear. Do you remember the idea made popular by biographer of Voltaire? I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. It seems almost quaint. But freedom of speech is not dead, and it found a new champion in Suzanne Nossel's new book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Suzanne Nossel is the CEO of PEN America, a 98-year-old organization that works at the intersection of literature, human rights, and freedom of expression in the U.S. and around the world. She worked in 2 White House administrations representing U.S. interests to the United Nations and has also worked with both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, as well as in the private sector with McKinsey, Bertelsmann, and Dow Jones. Suzanne Nossel is our City Club annual meeting keynote speaker. We're delighted to have her with us today. And as in every City Club forum, you can participate with your questions. Just text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794 to text your questions. You can also tweet them at the City Club, and we will work them into the second half of the program. Suzanne Nossel, welcome to the City Club of Cleveland.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It is so good to have you with us, and congratulations on the book. It is, just when you think there's everything that needs to be said about freedom of speech has been said, you come and say a whole lot of new things about it. Which I suppose is in many ways a response to these times. How is free speech doing?
It's under threat. Look, it's been a very challenging few years on multiple fronts. I think for all of us right now, we're living in an information ecosystem that is flooded with disinformation, where it is hard to sort fact from falsehood. You don't know when you come across information or postings on social media who's really behind them. Disclosures are reported in major papers. You have today the Wall Street Journal editorial page reporting about one thing and the news side saying that's not credible. So we're in uncharted waters, unprecedented times when it comes to free speech, with that threat of disinformation, this kind of Wild West on social media where we really have no rules in terms of how we want platforms to be moderating speech. And we see the harms of online speech running rampant, weaponized in this era. And yet also, I think, very well-founded reservations about having the likes of Twitter and Facebook exercise unfettered, non-transparent controls over these vast swaths of public discourse for which they account. We also have a president who has been hell-bent on going after his critics with threats, with intimidation, with, in some cases, acts of retaliation against journalists and media organizations, and with a systematic campaign to discredit credible journalism in the eyes of his supporters, to the point where anything virtually that is brought forward on a platform like the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN, he can dismiss on the basis that this is just the liberal media run amok. And so those who follow him shouldn't credit it and shouldn't believe it. And so, that's just the top of the list. We also have, and I deal with in the book, threats to free speech coming from the left, the censoriousness on college campuses, a kind of rigid orthodoxy that is setting in certain circles, where even questioning ideas like defund the police can get you into hot water if you're a professor and your students think that you've departed from what they believe and question your ideology or your opinion. So I think we're at a kind of delicate moment when it comes to free speech, which is why I wanted to write a book sort of setting this out and trying to rally what I hope will be a force of free speech defenders for the decades to come.
I feel like it's important to let our listeners and our audience know that you are essentially an optimist about the future of free speech, but your book lays out the really important work that is required. And I want to just sort of highlight the way that you do this in the book in grouping these. You lay out 20 principles for to guide this work, and you group them into 4 categories: principles for speaking, principles for listening, principles for debating free speech, and principles to keep in mind when you are creating free speech related policies. Let's just talk about speaking first, if we could. What are the principles that you think are most important when we are exercising our First Amendment rights?
Yeah, sure. The principle I start with is the idea of conscientiousness with language. And I should say, one of my premises in wanting to write this book was a concern that we are in danger of losing a rising generation to the principle of free speech, because people see it as at odds with the goals of bringing about a more equal, inclusive, and just society. And we know that this young generation, absolutely rightly is pushing us forward to address lingering, stubborn barriers to equality, systemic racism, and in so doing, at times, that movement can cross over into a kind of censoriousness, a feeling that hateful speech, noxious speech, offensive speech should be banned or punished, and that the only way to realize this more equal society is going to be by putting restrictions on speech. And that's something that I disagree with, but I do think we have to set out some parameters to govern and kind of guide free speech so that it can work for our diverse, digitized, and divided society. And so that's my kind of starting premise. And when it comes to speakers, the principle I begin with is the idea of using language conscientiously. And that encompasses a presumption of heterodoxy. So an assumption that if I'm speaking to this group, I can't see everybody out there in the audience. I don't really know who exactly is tuning in. And I should assume it includes people of all kinds of different backgrounds, races, religious beliefs, ideologies, political opinions. And if I keep that in mind, I will frame my ideas, my arguments, my points in an effort to appeal to everybody and to take into account some of the sensitivities that may come from that diverse audience in a way that I wouldn't do if I was just speaking to a bunch of friends who I knew well, where I could be edgier, I might make certain jokes, and I'd have a different approach to speaking in that kind of closed environment. Another principle I set out is being your own editor. Back in the day, if you were publishing something, it would go through layers of review, an editor, a copy editor. Now, if you're posting on social media, all that's been swept away. And so the responsibility really falls to us to give our words a reread, to think through how they might come across. If it's something sensitive, maybe show it to a friend and see what their reaction is. To be cognizant of terminology. One thing I talk about is non-binary gender pronouns, which to some people sort of sound a little unusual. It's not something that they're accustomed to, but why it is that to speak conscientiously in 2020, it's important to call people by the pronouns by which they choose to be known, and that really it's just an act of respect rather than doing ravages to our language, which is what some people have argued. So that's my starting premise, and then I have several more when it comes to speaking.
The book is called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. The author is Suzanne Nossel. She's CEO of PEN America, and she is our keynote speaker for our annual meeting. And Suzanne, I want to talk to you about in the second area that you identify, principles for listening. You say we should call out with caution. Calling out has become it's a function of or an activity on social media in some respects. But what do you mean when you say call out with caution?
Yeah, look, I think call outs have their place, but that they can also have a chilling effect on our discourse. And, we see that in cases where for example, a professor uses a word in class that some students consider offensive and then is the subject of petitions and boycotts and campaigns to get that person fired. We see it with editors who publish op-eds or articles that some object to, and then they call for the dismissal of the editor. And that can only strike fear in the hearts of every other editor who has to think twice about whether to take a risk. And it sort of narrows the parameters of what you can say and publish. And so what I advocate, I do think callouts have their place, but I also encourage people to consider the viability of doing what I call calling in. So raising the concern about offensive speech privately. And I give criteria for when I think that can work. When you think it was unintentional, you don't think this person is deliberately trying to offend. When you think it hasn't yet had a irreversible harmful impact on others. Maybe it's a tweet that only a few people have seen, and if you can call the person's attention to it, they can delete it or edit it to avoid that potential harmful impact. If you think they're going to be responsive, if they might actually be receptive to this case, that what they're saying is out of bounds, that it's noxious, that somebody may be hurt by it, those are reasons to call out and circumstances under which you can call out. Also, when if you have a trusted relationship with the individual, to call in. Calling out, I think, is warranted where something has happened very publicly, where it's somebody with a wide following, and people. I give the example of Barry Weiss tweeting out about the skater Mireille Nagasu, who, when she landed a quadruple axel and was the first Olympic skater to do so, Barry Weiss, the former New York Times columnist, tweeted out, "Immigrants, they get the job done." That line from Hamilton. And of course, Mireille Nagasu was not an immigrant. She's born here in the United States. And so the tweet was seen as sort of othering Nagasu, and sort of this idea that if you're of Asian American extraction, you're not quite an American, or you must be a newcomer here. And it was offensive to people. And I think it was right that she was called out. But I also think there is in that instance, she was trying to make a compliment. It was sort of a ham-handed compliment. But Chrissy Teigen, I thought, kind of had it right in her response to Barry Weiss by saying, look, this is not a 5-alarm fire. You said something that could have offended people. And you need to be aware of that, and you should apologize, but, we're not saying that you're the face of evil. And that measuredness is what often gets lost. People are subject to death threats, and it quickly can escalate out of control. And I think that's the dark side of callouts.
Well, and I think the callouts, and you really point to this and articulate a lot of this in the book, but that it gets to that tension in when we talk about freedom of speech, whose speech is, the speech of the individual versus and what happens with callouts, and when it becomes what's sometimes referred to as a social media mob, there's that's a large group of people exercising their First Amendment rights, their freedom of speech as well, and those two things wind up in conflict with one another, and also ultimately can end in or can point to unproductive outcomes.
No, I think it's a very important point, because look, we always say, free speech defenders kind of always say the best response to hurtful or incendiary speech is often counter speech. So just somebody coming in and rebutting it and making the opposite argument and being more persuasive, because the hateful ideas will fall of their own weight if they're just subject to fierce refutation. And I think that principle is true, but it does become occluded in our social media age, where that counter speech can become so thunderous, so overwhelming, such an avalanche that everybody who's watching the incident just thinks, my gosh, I have to back off. I don't even want to talk about a topic like whether it's rape or abortion or immigrants' rights or policing reform or anything controversial, because the risk is exactly what you say. Not that, I'll hear from a few people in a polite exchange in a newspaper letters to the editor column, which is how it used to happen 30 years ago. but rather that I'm going to be, made a spectacle of on social media. And, I may be doxxed, I may have my personal information revealed, I may be subject to physical threats. And so that counter speech, and, some of it crosses the line, but even where, people are simply expressing an opposing opinion, when it coalesces, at that degree of volume, it can have a very intimidating effect. And so it's just something we have to be aware of in our discourse. It doesn't make counter speech wrong. I think it still can be incredibly effective, but it also can have a kind of paradoxically censorious result.
Counter speech is sort of one consequence of exercising one's freedom of speech, being exposed to counter speech and being exposed to other points of view. Another consequence, particularly when the speech being exercised is borders on hate speech or is in fact hate speech, that then you begin to enter criminal territory. And there's a case, an Ohio case that you refer to in your book in the chapter about hate speech, in which there was an arrest. James Reardon was arrested in Youngstown in the Mahoning Valley, and U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, Justin Herdman, delivered a message to white supremacists. And I want to read the part that you quote, if that's all right. He said, "The Constitution protects your right to speak. If you want to waste the blessings of liberty by going down a path of hatred and failed ideologies, that is your choice. Democracy allows you to test those ideas in the public forum. What you don't have, though, is the right to take out your frustration at failure in the political arena by resorting to violence. You don't have any right to threaten the lives and well-being of our neighbors." Those are really, it was a strong defense of the First Amendment, but also a strong defense of contextualizing the First Amendment and saying it is important, but it has its place.
Yeah, what I thought was really important about that statement was that if we are going to, in this country, protect our very robust safeguards for even hateful speech, our population, the public, needs to have faith that that doesn't mean that hatred and supremacist ideologies are simply going to be allowed to run freely throughout society, with all of their harmful impact on the groups that they target. And I think that's something that, over the last few years, there has been this sense that hatefulness has been uncorked. It's been legitimized by the President of the United States. It's been out on our streets. I mean, we were just talking, before this call about sort of these very public demonstrations of bigotry that have been emboldened over the last few years. And quite understandably, in response to this, there are intensifying calls to regulate, ban, punish, and shut down hateful speech out of a sense of almost desperation. Look, we can't have our children growing up in this kind of environment. And so we've got to do something, let's crack down as a legal matter. And I think what Herndon did so artfully is say, look, we absolutely take this kind of venom seriously. And, we're going to stop at nothing to prosecute these people and find them wherever they are. They can't hide from us. But, what we're not going to do is cut back on the free speech protections that all of us enjoy. We don't need to do that in order to tackle the problem of white supremacy head on and vanquish it. And I think that's an extremely important message. And people have to have that faith that we are going to be able to surmount this swelling tide of white supremacy, or else I really think our free speech protections are going to be in danger, because people will demand a resort to the narrowing of the parameters of free speech if they think that's what it's going to take to put a lid on this.
So other nations, other democracies have limitations on freedom of speech, stronger limitations than we have in America. I guess, why are they wrong and we right?
Look, you're right. I mean, we have the most protective standard for free speech virtually in the world under the First Amendment. In Europe and in Canada, they have much broader latitude, for example, to prosecute incitement to discrimination or racial hatred, whereas in this country, you can only prosecute incitement to imminent violence. So you can't prosecute me for telling a bunch of people that they ought to hate women or demean minorities or ridicule a particular religion. That's not prosecutable speech here in this country, whereas it could be in Europe or Canada. Holocaust denial is often the example that is given and has come into the news recently because Facebook has just banned Holocaust denial, which is illegal in many parts of Europe, and of course protected speech under the First Amendment here in this country. Where I think our standard is better, and I talk about this at length in Dare to Speak, is in that, really what you're doing when you offer that greater latitude is just affording the government more power to police speech. And you really have to think about whose power whose power that becomes. I think when people consider the advisability of broader restrictions on hateful speech, who do they imagine sort of doing the line drawing? Who's going to decide whether we're having a legitimate argument about the Israel-Palestine conflict or whether, it's become anti-Semitic or it's anti-Palestinian or it's anti-Arab or anti-Muslim? Who's going to make those decisions? And I think people sort of have in their minds some magical combination of a Thurgood Marshall and a Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Barack Obama and, this idealized vision of sages who would draw those lines sort of exactly as we would. But, look at the Supreme Court, look at the Trump administration Justice Department and the judges that they have appointed across the country. These are in many cases, they're judges who may be ideologically driven. They may have their own biases and beliefs. And so if you give them that latitude, you have to accept that they're going to use it as they see fit. And I think the Trump administration is a very vivid illustration of why that would be dangerous. We know that if he could go further in punishing speech, he would punish the speech of his critics. He's already, tried to do that in many ways, tried to get books suppressed from publication. The First Amendment has stood in his way, but if we were to pare it back, that's exactly what he would do. And so, to me, that's a very potent illustration of why, an approach that would extend the controls of government over our landscape of speech is a dangerous one.
Suzanne Nossel is our speaker today at the City Club Friday Forum. It's our annual meeting, and she's our annual meeting keynote. And every year we try to take a moment to really look at the state of free speech in America. If you have questions for her, please text them to 330-541-5794 or tweet them at the City Club, and we'll work them into the program. Suzanne, I have so many things I want to ask you, but what are we to do? And what I mean by that is, what are non-governmental organizations who care about this supposed to do? And what should individual citizens who find that there is so much to that the world of free speech, the world we have created in America, is the discourse we have created is challenging. And we don't always want to give a platform or give oxygen to voices we find detestable, no matter which side you're on. So what's a patriotic, good, red-blooded American who loves the First Amendment to do?
Yeah, look, I really wrote the book for the citizen, not for First Amendment lawyers, not for people who have as their day job, as I do, the defense of free speech, but for people who are engaging in these issues over their dining tables or in classrooms or out in the streets as part of protests. And my hope is that this balance of principles, the idea of being conscientious, but also at the same time defending the right to voice unpopular speech, that they come together as sort of a set of ways in which you can vociferously defend free speech, but without compromising other liberal values. And when it comes to institutions, I think there is a special responsibility. I talk in the book about the duty of care that we have if we have a special platform. If you're a professor in front of a classroom, if you have your own talk show, if you run the City Club of Cleveland, as you do, there is a special responsibility in thinking about how you use your words, how you're respecting those who are in your audience. I also think it's extremely important, and I devote a chapter to the idea of defending the right to voice unpopular speech. And I think, one of the things I worry about the most is just that because of all of this fractiousness, that we're retreating from a truly broad and encompassing range of ideas, that it's just become kind of too costly to buck the conventional wisdom, to book a speaker who might be controversial, to offer a platform to somebody who talks about sensitive topics in ways that not everybody agrees with. And I think it's extremely important, whether you're a bookseller deciding what to carry in your store, or you're an organization like PEN America, which I run, or like the City Club of Cleveland, that you do offer that breadth of ideas, that you do take the risk of creating a forum for somebody who is going to challenge your listeners and bring up ideas that they may not be entirely comfortable with. Because, you know, if we don't do it, increasingly nobody will. We know that people are living within filter bubbles on social media. They're choosing what to pay attention to, who to hear from. And, you know, we have the power to introduce them to something that they might not necessarily choose or seek out themselves. And I think we have to use that responsibly. It doesn't mean we have to give a platform to, you know, quacks or supremacists, but I think there needs to be room for a range of ideas. And that's something that, you know, all of us, as we operate within civil society, need to take seriously.
Suzanne, also, I want to ask you as well, both a question. I want to ask this on like sort of two levels at the same time, if possible, both personal and a kind of professional philosophical level. But why is this so important to you?
You know, for me, I've been involved in human rights work for most of my career, both within government and in the non-governmental sector. And to me, free speech is the human right that underpins all others. So whether you want to advocate for climate justice or for women's rights or immigrants' rights or the right to health, if your right to free speech is compromised and impaired, and you can't write letters, you can't post on social media, you can't go out into the streets and protest if it comes to that, then your ability to advance all these other social goods is compromised. And so, you know, to me, it's very fundamental. And I have become concerned that we're losing our footing. You know, when you talk to Americans about free speech, they all reflexively think of the First Amendment, and they sort of think of courts and lawyers and famous Supreme Court cases. And there's a sense that, you know, that's all in hand, that we're in relatively good shape. And yet, you know, if you ask them about what's happening on their campus or their conversation with their grandchildren, you know, actually they'll tell you there's an enormous amount that people are afraid to say, or that they're getting into frequent controversies over the bounds of reasonable opinion and discourse. And so I think we're sort of missing something if we believe we can simply leave it to the courts and the lawyers to defend our free speech rights. I think we have to kind of rekindle for ourselves as a citizenry a commitment to these values and an understanding of how, as we become, which I think we are becoming and we must become, a more inclusive, equal, diverse society. We're definitely becoming more diverse, and I think we're now reckoning in serious ways with what that means and how we become a less racist society. And as we do that, I think it's extremely important that we not lose sight of the role of free speech as a catalyst for progress.
As I said, we're with Suzanne Nossel at the City Club Friday Forum. She's our annual meeting keynote speaker. And if you have a question for her, please text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet it at the City Club and we'll work it in. Suzanne Nossel, a question for you. Much of what you would seem to require assumes good faith all around and some basic principles of civil discourse and nonviolence. Does the absence of these complicate your ideas?
You know, it absolutely does. I mean, I'm appealing to people who I think are reasonable, who are not, you know, out to seed bigotry in our society, who are not spoiling for a violent fight. And but I also think the more of us that can be mobilized around a set of reasoned principles that can allow you to express your opinion, the better off we'll be, and the greater chance we have of marginalizing those who would deliberately undermine that. So I worry about the situation right now where free speech, I talk about this in the book, has become so politicized. And you had Donald Trump Jr. at the Republican convention declaring that the Republicans are the party of free speech. I think that's actually very dangerous, because a rising generation of young people says, oh, well, that's not for me. You know, that's a conservative set of principles that has nothing to do with the struggles that I am waging for racial justice or climate justice. And so I think that's very dangerous, and that we need to rally around these principles, whether you're on the right or the left, and be better able to fend off those who willfully undermine them.
Another question for you. Can you speak about how our laws currently seem to equate speech and money?
Yes, I mean, that is a serious issue. And I think what the question is talking about is the vast protections that the Supreme Court has afforded to corporate speech in the context of campaign contributions, saying that limits on campaign contributions are unconstitutional because it's an infringement on the speech rights of corporations. And, you know, I think that has contributed to this sense that free speech is a conservative set of values, that it's a array of principles that wind up reinforcing the power inequities in our society and compounding inequality. And I think it's extremely important to address that in the context of our defense of free speech. I devote a chapter of the book to the steps that we need to take to prevent free speech from reinforcing inequality and to amplify and elevate lesser heard voices. And I think part of that is campaign finance reform, to make sure that more people have a say and can express themselves. I am somewhat heartened by the fact that over the last few years, we have seen this mass mobilization of campaign contributions, and that, you know, I think the average donation size to Joe Biden's campaign with its huge coffers is $42. And so, you know, we have seen ordinary citizens exercise, you know, if campaign contributions, if you even indeed accept the Supreme Court's notion that campaign contributions constitute a form of speech, we are seeing a lot of people speak out.
Another question for you, Suzanne Nossel, CEO of Pan America and author of Dare to Speak. How do you balance the right to free speech with the vast amount of disinformation now being disseminated? What do we lose when society starts to view mainstream media as biased? For example, many are enraged that the media won't report on Hunter Biden's emails.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. We did a report at Pan America in 2017 called Faking the News. And it was an analysis of fake news and disinformation as a threat to free expression, even though overwhelmingly the content in question is protected by the First Amendment. You know, you're allowed to lie and dissemble, and you know, under most circumstances, you can hide your identity if you want to. That's not illegal. So much of this information is protected by the First Amendment, and yet when it floods the zone, it absolutely impairs free expression. It really goes to, well, why do we protect free expression in the first place? That's actually the last chapter of the book, and I talk about, you know, why, going back to ancient Greece, we have treasured free expression, and it's not just for its own sake. It's because we see it as a catalyst to get to the truth, a way to ensure that the best ideas rise to the foreground if there's this kind of contested marketplace, as an enabler, an accelerant of social progress, and all sorts of other societal goods. And when you have an information ecosystem that becomes overwhelmed with disinformation, that function of free speech is impaired. You know, you're not going to see the best ideas rise to the foreground because, you know, the people purveying them, you know, you think are your neighbors, and they're actually back in Moscow. And so, you know, their reasoning holds no weight. And you know, I think what's particularly dangerous is this increasing sense that just people don't know what to believe. I mean, when President Trump was diagnosed with coronavirus, a lot of people in my feed sort of said, you know, is this a hoax? And that feeling is constant. You know, the Hunter Biden emails, you know, I don't know quite what to make of them. And I'm not sure if we will know, especially not in time for the election. You know, the social media companies have become substantially more aggressive than they were certainly in 2016 in trying to safeguard themselves from, an incident. That disclosure in the New York Post, I would say, bore quite clear hallmarks of a disinformation operation. The nature of the emails, the way that some of them were captioned, the metadata on them, the fact that it was leaked out through the New York Post and Rudy Giuliani. So there were many earmarks of a disinformation operation. That doesn't necessarily mean the underlying emails aren't what they purport to be, but the question of, well, why are they being disclosed at this time, by whom, and for what purpose? And I think it is a positive thing that the platforms are becoming much more attentive to their role in this, because they're not just neutral platforms. It's not like this is just a bulletin board where you can tack up whatever you want and if people can walk by it or not. Their algorithms amplify and accelerate content, and they push forward messages, and they shape what we see and what we believe. And so the question becomes, how do they exercise that power responsibly? And I think what has been missing over the last week is a clear articulation of the standards by which they have kind of downgraded algorithmically those disclosures about Hunter Biden, and whether they would do the same thing, if it came to a similar disclosure in relation to the Trump campaign or another conservative campaign. Because I think if they are seen as ideologically biased, that has a whole lot of other boomerang effects. It intensifies the determination of some in Congress to regulate these platforms, potentially pushing the boundaries of the First Amendment. It pushes people into shadowy realms of the dark web where they can say nefarious things and we never know about them, and that can be even more dangerous. So it's very tricky. I think it was somewhat of a positive step that they attended to this so quickly, but we are still waiting for a full explanation of what they did and why, and how those principles will apply to future incidents.
So that's connected to another question we have from a listener about kind of what your recommendations would be for social media platforms. And I might put the question a different way. If you were asked to testify before a congressional subcommittee on this, what would you advise them to do?
Look, I think it's very complicated. I devote a couple of chapters in the book to it. And, they're essentially almost juxtaposed against one another. The first is a set of cautionary notes about why we should be leery of giving these platforms unfettered discretion to police speech as they see fit. They're profit-making entities. They have their own ideological predilections. When they moderate content, we've seen time and again that they sort of do it incompetently, and there are all kinds of mistakes, and there are no fail-safes. They over-rely on artificial intelligence. And so I don't think we should, I think we need to be very careful. They're non-transparent, and we often don't know what's disappearing or why. At the same time, we've all seen the weaponization of content online, whether it's disinformation, which we were just talking about, or online harassment, or conspiracy theories, or false information about COVID that could prolong the pandemic. And so I don't think that can be downplayed. My full expectation is that content will become progressively more regulated in the years to come, both moderated by the companies themselves and externally regulated by government. Europe is already far ahead of us on this, but I think in the new year, in the new Congress, that Washington is going to get serious about this as well. The demands are coming from platform users, from advertisers, and from regulators themselves who feel political pressure on this issue. What I think is extremely important from a free expression perspective is that as we become more aggressive in policing online content, we need far more reliable, accessible fail-safes for the inevitable false positives. So inevitably, if Facebook is getting more forward-leaning when it comes to expunging disinformation, there's going to be some stuff that their algorithms or their human moderators believe is disinformation, that has the hallmarks, that sort of triggers the alarm bells, and yet is satire, is the legitimate opinion from a political actor or a candidate for office, and that belongs on the platform by their own standards. And today, if that happens, you don't have much recourse. You can file an appeal, but very often you'll hear nothing. And if you do get a response, it could be weeks or months after the fact, when the impact of what you're saying would have been in real time. And so I think what they need to do is create, I call it a global content defender. I envision it almost like a public defender, but a service that would be available to people who believe that their expressive rights have been violated, to be able to get someone, whether it's an advocate or attorney, on the line who can actually engage with the companies to get redress in real time, to protect and uphold those expressive rights in an environment where I believe content is going to be far more regulated than it is today. That's a nifty idea, but do you think it's actually viable? I think it could be. I mean, they have unlimited resources, so that's that's not a hurdle. The Facebook is just in the process of rolling out this content review board, which has a different function. It's really not looking at individual cases of every person who says, wait, my post has disappeared. Why is that? It's looking more at systemic issues and kind of like almost a kind of Supreme Court of Facebook to review their decisions after the fact. But they put a lot of money into standing it up. They've enlisted a lot of experts, and I think they could do something that would be accessible to the ordinary user. Other companies in other industries have customer service. If your credit card doesn't work, you can get someone from Visa on the line, when you're standing there at the point of sale at Costco to, take off the hold that has come in because, they think they think there's some kind of fraud. If you can prove you're you, they'll let it through. And, Facebook and Twitter and the like have never had to offer any customer service because their users are not technically customers. The services are free, and yet they make so much money off of their user bases that I think their obligations should be seen as commensurate to these other types of industries where that level of customer service, being able to get a human being on the line, is normal and natural. And, a lot of these cases I think could be resolved pretty simply. They involve complex line drawing exercises about what exactly the boundaries of hate speech are in Myanmar. That might take a more involved review. But if it's just a mistake or something that is clearly satirical or clearly just garden variety political expression, that it should be possible to recognize that in real time with the help of a trained person. We just received a question from our board president, Robin Minter-Smyers, your friend, as well. And she writes, the City Club of Cleveland is home to many dedicated members, some of whom have belonged for decades. We've long strived to be nonpartisan and invite people from many different perspectives to the podium. We now also want to be actively anti-racist. How should we be true to free speech and our other values when we invite speakers? Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's great to be here with Robin, who's an old and dear friend. And I'm only sorry that I'm not in Cleveland and able to have dinner with Robin tonight, because that would have been really special. But it's nice to be together virtually. Look, I think this is really one of the complex, what you fingered in your question is a really complex and important issue. This impulse that we all have to be more affirmatively anti-racist, how does that square with still presenting a breadth of ideas? And I think it's extremely important, whether you're the Cleveland Club or you're Penn America, we do a lot of public programming ourselves, that we don't have to present people who are bigoted, who have promulgated racist ideologies. I don't think anyone has to invite Charles Murray to be a speaker on their campus or at their club or in their public programs. But I think it's important to find people who are asking tough questions. There was a really interesting article, for example, in the New York Times the other day about the term white supremacy and whether, which is a term that, from my perspective, what I liked about the article is that it put into words something that I had thought a lot about, but that's frankly hard to talk about, which is like sort of the idea that white supremacy can refer to everything from, Charlottesville marauders, murderous marauders, to kind of a white legacy institution, like a college, let's say the University of Pennsylvania, that, was started by white people and populated by white people, for most of its history, and so has that legacy. But if you use the term white supremacy to encompass that whole spectrum, you're lumping an awful lot together. And this article kind of parsed that, and there were a number of Black scholars and critics that were quoted who actually kind of reject this surging use of the term white supremacy. And I think that discussion, like convening some of those thinkers together to unpack the word white supremacy, the term white supremacy, would be a really interesting way of upholding your mission to be anti-racist and to sort of probe the depths of how we become a less racist society, but without adhering to just kind of a doctrinaire set of views, and showing that, look, there's a spectrum of opinion, even when it comes to, how we describe this anti-racist effort.
Another question for you, Suzanne Nossel. Have you considered all the good that these, quote, impediments to free speech have done for social justice? As a Black person, cancel culture has given me a way to level the playing field between minorities and people in power. Censorship is not always a bad thing. Cancel culture has added a sense of accountability to free speech.
Yes, and I think it's an important point. And I have in the book a discussion of the fact that there's some circumstances where I absolutely agree. I think canceling or calling out is perfectly legitimate, and it can be quite ferocious, and that's sometimes deserved. If you're facing down overt racism, I think you need to kind of punch back with a commensurate level of energy and potency. And I'm not arguing for a measured, kind of calm, civilized response in every instance. I think there's some circumstances that warrant something different. And I also think, the last few months have been a outpouring of free speech. I mean, what we saw, particularly out on the streets in the demonstrations, that was a very robust and vigorous exercise of free speech rights. When people's rights, protesters' rights, were impaired by overly aggressive policing and kettling and attacks on journalists and reporters covering the protests, I think those protesters actually came to see, why the First Amendment protections that they enjoy are so valuable and important. It's their right to be able to go out and make demands and force reform and, sit in outside of the precinct and demand change, push to get a particular officer or commander off the force if that person is no longer tenable in their role. And so, look, I think that my hope is that there is a recognition that I believe what is really useful for those movements for social justice is not the censorship and not the restrictions on speech, but rather the right to speak out and the power to speak out and the means to speak out. And we're seeing right now, one thing I talk about in the book, in the chapter about inequality, is how unequal the access to the platforms for speech has been, whether it's journalism or publishing or who's on television, the barriers of exclusion that have reinforced inequities. And we're seeing some of that, right now being taken down. I was just looking at, who the LA Times is promoting and appointing, and it's a very diverse group of editors that are now taking the reins there. There have been a number of high-level appointments in publishing that are bringing about change. And I think those are great strides toward the realization of free expression. And so, my hope is that the movement for social justice will recognize that free speech ultimately is a tool for them to use, not an impediment to what they're trying to achieve.
Another question for you, Suzanne. Your principles regarding free speech and its threats seem sound. Your examples sound as though they come from a left-wing perspective. Do you view the threat to free speech currently mainly from the right?
I really think it's both. I mean, I think that they're different, but I would say, one of my primary motivators in writing this book, as I mentioned, is really to try to speak to young people on the left who become alienated from the principle of free speech. And so, that inflects the choice of some of the examples. I think on the right, at least insofar as young people, they are quite conscious of the ways in which their free speech rights can be impinged upon. And it's not easy to be a young conservative on campus right now. And we did some work at the University of California, Berkeley, around the incidents a couple of years ago where you had these right-wing provocateurs, Milo Yiannopoulos, coming to campus and creating a lot of disturbance with a message that was anti-immigrant and misogynist and racist, and that attracted a very potent reaction and set of protests, and the university first shut him down and then allowed him to come back. And when we had a sort of sit down with some of the stakeholders, the young conservatives on campus said, the reason they did that and they invited him was that they feel kind of edged out on that very liberal campus. It's hard for them to find faculty advisors for their clubs. They can't book rooms for their events because you need to get an academic department to be willing to be a co-sponsor. And I think this really goes to the obligation of institutions to take affirmative steps to embrace a range of ideologies and viewpoints. I honestly sort of believe if the college Republicans at Cal Berkeley had felt a bit more welcomed and there was a bit more space for them on campus, they would have continued with what they had done before that, which was sort of inviting state senators and local legislators to come to speak to interested students instead of trying to take over, the whole campus common with, a firebrand speaker the way they did.
You bring up that example, and in the book you also pair that with the example of Richard Spencer speaking at the University of Florida, and I wonder if you could remind us how the university responded.
Yeah, look, as we analyzed these incidents here at Penn, came around to the idea that actually when you have a Milo Yiannopoulos or a Richard Spencer who has been invited to campus, in the case of Milo, the college Republicans were sort of entitled to invite him, and Richard Spencer in Florida, he rented a hall that's open to anybody to rent. They're both public universities, so they couldn't shut it down. And what we concluded is that actually being shut down is exactly what these provocateurs wanted, that there was nothing better for Milo than the headline of being shut out of Cal Berkeley. His First Amendment rights were violated. He could grandstand. He could go back to his supporters for donations. He could file, a lawsuit and probably win it because he's taking on a public university. And so our perspective is that the much better approach is really the one that the University of Florida took when Richard Spencer booked an auditorium, which is to say, okay, you have your event. You're a citizen. You're entitled to use this auditorium. No matter your viewpoint, but we absolutely and fundamentally reject your message. We're going to rally the campus around an alternative message. Gators, not haters, was their hashtag. We're going to allow counter protests to go forward in a organized, kind of peaceful way where we're limiting the risk of violence. And that took the wind out of Spencer's sails. He didn't have a big audience. He didn't get the publicity of a mega showdown. He wasn't able to say he was shut down. He gave his speech, and that was kind of the end of it. I think actually the universities over time kind of wised up and have taken this approach, and that's why we've seen those kind of provocateur tours sort of die down over the last couple of years.
Suzanne Nossel is the CEO of PEN America. She's the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. She's been our keynote speaker for our City Club Friday Forum, which is also our annual meeting. Suzanne Nossel, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this today and for your contributions to really a vast literature on free speech and the case for free speech. And I want to also point out that there's at least 10 principles that we didn't get to.
You can't get to everything. I know there's a lot to say when you talk about free speech. And one of my premises was that sort of if you leave out any of it, people are going to accuse you of overlooking something really important. So it's important to put it all together. But I really appreciate the chance to be here with you and with Robin and the community in Cleveland. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for being a part of it. This forum today was our Samuel O. Friedlander Memorial Forum on Free Speech. Mr. Friedlander was a member of the City Club for most of his life, serving as president in 1962 during our 50th year. His daughter, Nina Friedlander Gibbons, was one of the first women to become a member of the City Club and served on the board in the 70s, and she is still an active member today. Thanks also to our members, sponsors, and donors and others who support our mission to create conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. You can find out more and join them at cityclub.org/thank-you. We just added a new forum to our schedule for Monday night, actually. You should check it out. A conversation about tech, racial justice, and the youth vote with Dr. Cornell West, Mutali Nkonde of AI for the People, Shakira Diaz of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, and local advocate Angela Woodson. Next Friday, October 30th, we'll talk with local author David Giffels about his book, Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America. Also, in September, we launched a new video series called Democracy Unchained. Our 6th episode was released last night. We look at combating the influence of money in politics with Zephyr Teachout of Fordham University, former U.S. Senator Russ Feingold, author and attorney Chi-Sun Lee, and Stephen Heinz, president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, along with many others. You can find out more and check out the episodes at democracyunchained.io. That's democracyunchained.io. I'm Dan Malthrop. Stay strong, stay healthy. Please wash your hands, keep your distance, and wear a mask. And thank you for voting. And finally, stay close in your hearts if you can't be close in person. Our forum is adjourned.